Okay, think about this for a second. What if I told you that the entire blueprint for our modern world, how we build our cities, how we write laws, even how we tell time, was all designed by a civilization that completely vanished over 4,000 years ago? Yeah, seriously. The story of the ancient Sumerians, well, in a lot of ways, it's our own origin story.
But let me start with a quick question for you. Have you ever actually stopped and wondered why your watch or your phone counts to 60? Why are there 60 seconds in a minute? Why not 10 or 100? I mean, it seems kind of random, doesn't it? Well, spoiler alert, it's not.
The answer to that question is actually 6,000 years old, and it's buried deep in the sun-baked earth of ancient Mesopotamia, in a land between two rivers with a group of people called the Sumerians.
To really get a handle on who they were, we have to start where they did, right on the banks of the mighty Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And for the early Sumerians, these rivers were literally everything. They were both their greatest, most terrifying threat and their greatest gift. See, every single year, these violent floods would just surge down from the mountains without any warning, wiping out absolutely everything in their path. Chaos. But, and this is a huge but, once those waters finally receded, they left behind this incredibly rich, fertile black soil called silt. So the very same force that could destroy them was also the secret to this unimaginable abundance. And this, right here, is where human ingenuity just kicks into high gear. The Sumerians didn't just put up with the floods. They decided they were going to control them. So they engineered the world's first massive irrigation systems. We're talking canals, dikes, reservoirs. And this one act of engineering created an agricultural revolution. For the very first time in history, they had a surplus of food. And that surplus changed absolutely everything. It meant that not everyone had to be a farmer anymore. People could become artisans or priests or rulers. And this specialization, that's what allowed tiny villages to grow into the world's very first cities.
And we're not talking about small towns here. We're talking about huge urban centers like Uruk, which might have been home to 80,000 people. I mean, that's a metropolis by ancient standards. Each of these cities was basically its own independent nation, a city-state, with its own king, its own army, its own patron god. They were quite literally the birthplaces of organized human society as we know it. But okay, managing a complicated city with thousands of people, all this surplus grain, and organized labor, that creates a whole new problem. How in the world do you keep track of it all? The answer to that would become Sumer's single greatest gift to humanity.
They invented writing. It's called cuneiform, which comes from the Latin word for wedge because of these little wedge-shaped marks they pressed into wet clay tablets. And what's so fascinating is why they invented it. It wasn't for poetry or for telling grand stories. Nope, it was for accounting. It was born from the super practical need to record transactions. You know, how many sheep were sold, how much grain was paid in taxes. History's greatest intellectual leap literally began as a ledger.
But you really can't overstate the impact of this. I mean, writing just fundamentally rewired human society. Before this, history was just memory. It was passed down and it got warped and changed over generations. After writing, history could be recorded. Knowledge was no longer stuck inside one person's head. It could be stored, shared, and built upon. This is the exact moment humanity moves from prehistory into history itself.
And, once an incredible tool like this is invented, its use just explodes. It very quickly went from just counting sheep to recording complex legal codes, documenting astronomical observations, and, most profoundly, telling stories about what it means to be human. They gave us the world's very first great work of literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's this incredible story about a king who, after losing his best friend, becomes absolutely terrified of death and goes on this epic quest for eternal life. Just think about that. The very first story ever written down is about friendship, loss, and the search for meaning. These are the exact same questions we're still wrestling with today.
So with cities growing and knowledge being recorded for the first time, the Sumerians started to build these complex social structures that we would now recognize as the blueprint for civilization. At the physical and spiritual heart of every single Sumerian city was this massive stepped pyramid called a ziggurat. Now, this wasn't just a temple. It was the center of everything. It was the home of the city's god, the main administrative hub, the economic warehouse. It was the skyscraper of its day, basically a man-made mountain connecting the earth to the heavens. And their society was super structured, almost like a pyramid itself. At the very top, you had the king and the high priests, who were the ones who talked to the gods. Below them, you had an upper class of wealthy merchants and military officers. Then came the skilled middle class, the scribes and the artisans. The vast majority of people, though, were farmers, making up the base of the pyramid. And right at the very bottom were slaves, who were often captives of war. It was a really rigid hierarchy for sure, but it was the organizing principle that made their complex cities actually work.
Now, for all its amazing fertile soil, Mesopotamia was missing some key resources like stone, metal, and good timber. This basically forced the Sumerians to become incredible traders. And then, around 3500 BCE, they invented something that would supercharge their economy and change the world forever: the wheel. All of a sudden, transporting heavy stuff over land became possible, opening up these huge trade networks that stretched for thousands of miles.
But you know how it goes. Like all great empires, their time eventually came to an end. All the constant fighting between the different city-states weakened them, and that made them vulnerable to outsiders.
Around 2334 BCE, they were conquered by a guy named Sargon of Akkad, who created the world's very first empire. The Sumerians, as a distinct people, would kind of fade into history, but here's the crucial point. You can conquer a people, but you can't conquer a good idea. Their conquerors just adopted their writing, their religion, their technology, and passed it all down through the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and eventually all the way to us.
Which brings us right back to our original question. Why 60 seconds in a minute? The answer is the Sumerians. They used a base 60 number system. While we use base 10 for most things, their system was so good it got passed down through the Babylonians, who then applied it to astronomy and geography. And that ancient way of counting is now hardwired into every clock, every compass, and every globe on the entire planet.
I mean, their legacy is just staggering when you think about it. The 60-minute hour, the 360-degree circle, the wheel, the very first written laws, the whole concept of a city, the first epic poem. We are, in so many fundamental ways, still living in a world that was built by the Sumerians.
They were the first ones to dare to build something permanent, the first to bring order from chaos, and the first to write their story down so it would never be forgotten. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Thousands of years from now, when our own time is just another layer of dust in the ground, what ideas from our civilization will they find? What will be powerful enough to become immortal?